Hi, welcome back to Teen Stock Politics. I'm Sam, and today I'm joined by my co-host Andrew. And today we're going to be talking about the history of the Confederacy after the Civil War in America, and how that's affected the United States today, and especially these politics with especially with with, with respect to recent demonstrations by Trumpist supporters and among other things. So on our first bullet point, we're going to be talking about the history or hate aspect of the Confederate flag. An argument possibly made by these far right and Republican supporters of the Confederate flag, which are a minority yet still prevalent in the far right community. But there's a certain aspect where it turns into history or hate, and obviously a lot of people have different views about this, but we're just trying to comment on what we think about this. So Andrew, what do you think about the history or hate aspect of the Confederate flag and what it represents today?
I think, as a whole of the Confederacy, they lost the Civil War, obviously. The Union, led by Ulysses S. Grant and President Lincoln, we won that war. And that is why the South is part of the United States today. The fact that the South was able to really write history in most of those southern states is kind of astonishing. Yes, they controlled government down there, but the federal government didn't step up and teach the curriculum that they were teaching down in the South, which makes sense because the whole issue of the Civil War, which most will argue was slavery, and then some people will also argue that it was states' rights. At the end of the day, it's probably more slavery than anything else because do we genuinely believe that if slavery had not been an issue, do you think we would have had a war that would have divided the entire country over states' rights? And I highly doubt that would have been the case. However, the fact that the Confederacy was able to basically write history down from Virginia south is kind of crazy. You were able to teach, indoctrinate really, your future generation of citizens from the South to think, okay, so the Confederacy was all about states' rights. Slavery wasn't even an issue, which obviously it was. This is sarcasm. And they're taught that the Confederate flag, at least from old history books in like states like Georgia, I've seen, where they make it seem like the Confederacy treated slaves with good care without pay, really, when obviously we know that's not true. And that's a big excuse almost of why they say the Confederate flag is flown around today. It's the sign of history. Some people believe it wasn't bad history. Obviously, the Civil War, slavery, the South succeeding from from the Union, obviously that is bad history for the United States. However, some will argue, no, it was not. And even those that say, yes, it was bad, yes, the Civil War was bad and should not have happened, they still say, well, we can fly it so we don't forget our history, which is weird to me because you don't see Germans flying around the Nazi flag saying, oh, we're preserving history of German history. You do not see that, but America likes to be different. They're like, okay, we're going to fly a Confederate flag. We know it's bad, at least some of them realize that the Civil War is bad, and they continually fly the Confederate flag around, saying it's to preserve history. Once again, if we go back to the simile with like how Germany doesn't actually fly the Nazi flag around, it's kind of crazy to me. You don't see. I don't know how they split up Germany, but of course in the United States, it's we split it up into states. I don't really know how they do it in Germany, but they're districts, I guess. In Germany, you don't see their flags having Confederate flags on that. We have the state flags. I don't know what they have. Obviously, places like Georgia, there used to be a Confederate flag on the state of Georgia. In 2020, there was a Confederate flag on the Mississippi flag that was recently removed, replaced with their state flower. The fact that it's taken this long to realize that, you know what, the Confederate flag, we don't fly it around to preserve history. No, we fly it around to preserve racism, to preserve hate. The hate in this country drives from this racism and the aspect that whites are superior to blacks, which is not true. And those that are flying around the Confederate flag, I think a vast majority of them, of course, this is generalizing a very large group of people. Most of them are white, and they say it's to preserve their history. What I don't think that's true. There are still plenty of people that look down on other races because they think that their race is superior to another race. Normally, it's a white person looking down on minorities, at least in this country. And I don't want to say that people that fly the flag are being racist, because that would be generalizing a massive group, like I said, and I don't want to do that. However, I think a big part of that is racism. I think if you fly the Confederate flag, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to present hate, something that represents hate in this country, bad history in the United States. This war was fought over slavery, which is a big, massive part of slavery. I mean, racism, sorry. To think that the reason we have, I mean, this is going little off topic, but it all connects in the end. The United States has a large minority population of blacks. Those, a vast majority of them were driven from Africa in the slave trade, that were driven up and sailed in ships from Africa, Western Africa, up to the East Coast in the United States. Sold and traded to the South because the northern states refused to have them because many European countries had already outlawed slavery. And that is why we have a large African American population. And that's because white people drove slaves into the East Coast. And for people nowadays that are descendants of these people that drove massive amounts of minorities, people like Tucker Carlson, who is trying to say that Democrats are driving immigration up because they're trying to replace the current voter base to basically have an output in American politics, affect it, put Democrats in office. And I hope I can connect this at the end because it's kind of all convoluted. However, he's saying that, okay, so we're driving minorities. Democrats are driving minorities, opening the borders. They can get American citizenship, which is not, that's not how that works, but we'll go with that. They vote for Democrats, and Democrats are in power. Same kind of deal here. We have a massive amount of black people that are in this country. A vast majority of them that have been here for generations. A vast majority of them had ancestors that were slaves in the South. Flown above them while you were harvesting cotton or whatever your job was as a slave was the Confederate flag. To say that the Confederate flag is to represent history, yes, it was a part of history. Symbols of hate you don't fly around. To a certain group of people, the Confederate flag represents suffering of ancestors. The Confederate flag represents hate and racism towards their race. Especially with the big deal of Confederate leaders. Old leaders on college campuses, town squares, where you have Confederate generals, people that were in the Confederate Army. They have a statue commemorating them. We don't just go around and find Hitler statues commemorating him.
Mm-hmm.
But the Confederacy ends up doing that. Germany doesn't have that, but you know what? The Confederacy that lost the war does. And now people are saying we're trying to preserve history by trying to knock down this statue, which many neo-Nazis have gathered around these statues. Many KKK members, former members, and when that group was a really big part of American society only decades ago, they gathered around these statues as really a symbol of leadership, of what they were striving for, if that
Hmm.
makes any sense. And
Yeah, Andrew,
it's
you
just the
yeah,
hypocrisy, really.
Andrew, yeah, you do drive a valid point of why do we commemorate this type of behavior around the fact that it's a symbolism of hate and um, this history is by it's not fairly represented because it's again a symbol of hate. But another thing to kind of take a look at, and which is we're moving on to our next bullet point, is why does the right associate with the Confederate flag more often than typically the left? And is there a reason behind that? Now, a lot would speculate that it's just because of the issue of racism and past in the past the conservative right have been a lot typically more racist towards African Americans, and as you were talking about earlier about how a lot of these African Americans who don't who support the people who don't oppress them, they're gonna vote for them. And so it's kind of like a double-edged sword of either change your ways now and in the future benefit from these voters who will support your decisions, which kind of what happened back in the in the 1900 mid 1900s because the party flip, and we talked about that in a past episode, which you can go watch. But regardless, these parties, they're going to support the people who matter to them the most. And the Trumpism has really been tied to racism, and this is further showing how the Confederate flag ties to these far right groups. Because the conservative era back there was the Democrats, and Democrats were the slave owners. And now the tides have turned, and it's the black people who are supporting the Republicans. I mean, not the Republicans, the Democrats, I'm sorry. But it's time to show that Trumpism should not be associated with the Confederate flag, as it is, as you were saying, an extreme symbol of hate and a show of what they believe in. And that is not helping them win African American votes, especially in areas like the South, where they've historically been oppressed, where they have ancestors who were literally working for their ancestors. Like, how weird is that? Some some ancestors of the republic of the typical Republicans were probably vote were probably owners of some African American voters ancestors. It's just weird to think that these types of people would support this, and it's weird. Do you have any thoughts on conservatism, Trumpism, and the Confederate flag, Andrew, or
I
should
will
we
say,
move
I
on?
think you generalized it too much when you said that you're traditional Republican. There are plenty of minority Republicans. There are only like 1 in 10, according to recent polls, where black voters vote for Republicans, where the other 90 or so
Hmm.
percent vote Democrats. So I think that's generalizing too much, but I do get your point. However, another thing I want to mention is that you said yes, the Confederacy was mainly just Democrats, really. The South was mainly just Democrats. And the reason this was is because slavery prevented black people from voting, obviously, because the South wanted more electoral power. I think if you go to history class, you would know this. They want more power in the South with more electoral votes, more House districts. So they wanted their slaves to count. However, they did not want them to count as a full vote, if that makes sense. And obviously, blacks would vote in their interest, while whites would vote in their interest. Their interest was, okay, how do we keep our production of cotton, our production of tobacco, or whatever you're growing, cheap? And you keep it cheap by not paying your workers. That's slavery. That is how the South, that's how their economy was driven. And it was all because of workers. However,
Hmm.
black people, their interest would be, how do I get out of the situation? That's how you have anti-slavery presidents like Abraham Lincoln. He didn't run on an anti-slavery agenda. However, he did end up freeing slaves, as he famously did. And of course, the reason that it was so heavily Democratic is because the suppression of the black vote, not only with owners not letting their slaves vote, but also because it is, it like one slave is like one fifth of the person. That number is probably wrong, but it was
Hmm.
something like that. It was a
Somewhere
fraction,
around that.
and that would be a big reason why it was dominated by Democrats for such a long time until now. You have a bunch of black people that, once they're freed of slavery or they run away from slavery, depending on what time they end up leaving the South, they go in drove, basically, with mass migrants, domestic migrants, up north, where they would end up in New York, Illinois, and other states in the New England area, Northeast. And that's why that has such a large black population. As time goes on,
Hmm.
black people are being brought down to the South from own interests, with they have a job offer or something, whatever their scenario might be. And that's how you get a blue Georgia in 2020. That's how you get a narrowed North Carolina. That's how you get southern states like Texas and other states like that to narrow up, because no longer are black people only a fraction of one person, and their vote counts as a full person. You can get competitive states where you have white people voting for their interests, black people voting for their interests, and their votes are equal. And like Sam said, of course, these are now swapped. Back in the early 1800s, when this was a big deal, mid 1800s, well, it still is a big deal, but in terms of the Confederacy, obviously Republicans would be with the black population, anti-slavery, as Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and then the Democrats would be pro-slavery, pro the Confederacy, and now it's swapped. Not necessarily, Republicans don't say pro-slavery, yada yada. However, the things that they vote for are quite troubling. Things that Republican supporters will do, like fly the Confederate flag, which is dominantly flown by Republicans. Hate shown towards groups of Asians during COVID-19, predominantly Republicans. And, like, again, I don't want to generalize Republicans, but in terms of hate groups, Republicans do seem to be the party for these hate groups, for racial hate groups and other hate groups of the sort, whether it's over gender or homosexuality or something like that. They all seem to end up in the Republican Party and end up with violence. And to tie this back to Trumpism and everything, I think a big reason why Trump really drove these, I guess you could call, basically racist Republicans out of the water, is because his history. He had a history of not allowing a black person in his hotel, calling them the N word. That was on record. You had these neo Nazis, these ancestors to former Confederates, these racists that see Trump's record and he's like, that's my guy. It's proven again after he's elected president, 2017, after the neo Nazi attack in, where was it? Charlottesville, saying there were good people on both sides. The president of the United States said an attack between regular human beings and neo Nazis attacking Jewish people. He said there were good people on both sides. And I think this really just proved the point of these white supremacists, these neo Nazis, these racists, these pro segregationists, that Trump was the man for the job. And it's disappointing that we had a president in the White House for 4 years that represented these characteristics that a white supremacist would be looking for. And I really hope I've explained this well, because it's really all
Mhm.
over the
You've
place.
been taught.
But to tie it back to the Confederate flag is a symbol of hate, and Trump brought this hate to the surface, to the public's attention. Whether it's not calling out white supremacist neo-Nazi groups, or having his supporters in the United States Capitol alongside Trump 2020 flags, flying the Confederate flag of the United States inside the Capitol. Whether it's a combination of all these factors that really connect Trumpism, Donald Trump, connecting Donald Trump and the Confederate flag. And then I think this is really undeniable to say that these white supremacists, these neo Nazis, aren't driven to Donald Trump. And you know what represents these white supremacists and neo Nazis, where their foundations are from? The Confederacy. And you know what represents the Confederacy? The Confederate flag. Technically, it's not the Confederate flag, it's the battle flag for the Confederacy. However, that is the main one flown, so that's the one we're talking about. And I just think it's astonishing for anyone at this point to say it's a symbol of history. You're trying to preserve your history, yes. You don't want to delete history. You want to learn from past mistakes in this country. But to fly it in some sense of patriotism is, I think, kind of sad more than anything else. It's disappointing that a country, a first world country, is trying to go back to old ways, that there's a group of people in this country that want to go back to a time of segregation. I'm not saying everyone that's flying a Confederate flag is meaning that. However, just the optics don't look good if you're flying a Confederate flag with its history, what's going on now. And I just,
Mhm.
it's kind of crazy, really.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a good segue into our last bullet point, which is the states' rights. Like a major argument among Republican among Republican supporters who support the Confederate flag is that it's their states' rights. They gotta protect their state history, and the states will defend them. Albeit that may be true for some perspectives, it's just BS for excusing this behavior. States' rights never were meant to infringe, especially in the founding of our nation. They were never supposed to infringe on someone's rights, and that's where they messed up. And we need to show like state. I don't know how to put this, but there's a difference between straight up discrimination and wrongdoing than there is between representing your state with great pride and great joy. And the issue being is that this is usually a escape maneuver, which can drag on debates among these topics for a long time. Like recently in the Capitol building of our state, North Carolina, there has been the Confederate a Confederate monument was the highest standing monument in the Capitol plaza, and this monument stood towering over all of the other statues on the south, east, west, and north sides. And the issue recently has been trying to take that statue down, but because of the argument of states' rights, that this isn't a symbol of freedom, this is a symbol of individuality in our state's history, just dragged on the whole debate for a long time. 5 years until they were able to take that horrendous statue down. And this just shows to a testament of how far people are going to go just to hate, and it's just not acceptable, and we got to really take an initiative on it. Do you have any thoughts on the
I
states' rights
do.
aspect?
I'm pretty sure you just made all that up because the reason I put states' rights is not because of protecting history. No, it was because of the reasons of the Civil War. In the curriculum, only a few years ago, 10 years ago, we would learn that the reason the Civil War was fought was because of states' rights. Not slavery, not racism, nothing like that. It was all states' rights. The curriculum has changed. Hopefully, the human species has evolved. And now we are learning in school that it was because of slavery, racism, white supremacy. And the reason I put states' rights here is because the
Well,
people flying these Confederate flags, predominantly in the South, have learned in their curriculum at school that the Civil War was fought because of states' rights. And the Confederacy, their battle flag that they were fighting for, was based on states' rights and not slavery. And they say, okay, so we're flying this flag. If I believe the war wasn't fought over slavery and it's just states' rights, well, this is a representation of having states' rights. And I don't think if you genuinely believe that, you're kind of crazy because take slavery out of the Civil War. We did this at the beginning of the episode. Take that out of the Civil War. Would it have ever happened? The answer is no. We would not have split the country in half over states' rights. Supreme Court would have done something at some point to try to settle that matter with federal law. I do not think we would have gone to war over states' rights. Slavery, that was basically the foundation of the South's economy. Yes, maybe you will go to war over that, but not states' rights. And that's the reason I put that there, is because people will fly the Confederate flag saying we're flying this as a representation of states' rights because they think that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, not slavery. It's not, they say it's not supposed to represent hate. It's supposed to say we're preserving our history and we're representing states' rights, whether you live in Mississippi, Alabama, or any of the southern states, or any state at that matter, really, that is flying that flag. And
now
yeah.
the issue being is they're technically correct, albeit what they're teaching about that, the primary reason isn't because state rights. It's more of a general factor, but they're using it as an excuse and a scapegoat, to excuse their subtle yet harmful removal of their acts as being perpetrators of a revolution based mostly on slavery. So it's a very clever scapegoat technique, and so technically they are right. So and but what they're doing to disguise behind that is not true. Just to point that out, you can't say states' rights as just a singular factor. It's among other
Well, that's
things.
why I said that basically the South was able to write history for the South in terms of the Confederacy and the former states that were part of the Confederacy. And that's because they were able to write these curriculums, indoctrinate their kids to believe that they fought the Civil War over states' rights, not a problem over human rights,
Yep.
racism,
Which is a major
which
problem.
is slowly being solved today. It's only taken 200 years, less than that, but 100 something years, 150 years. But we're slowly getting back where we should have been 100 years ago. We should have started by learning, yes, slavery was the part that, or slavery was the reason that the Civil War was fought. But no, if you live in a former state of the Confederacy, you learn about states' rights, which is not right. That is not why the Civil War was fought. And at this point, I hope a vast majority of the population understands that. And maybe that would solve the problem of the Confederate flag being flown. I don't get it. You lose a war and you still fly that flag around? Where else does that happen? Genuinely. It just blows my mind, really. And I think we're about to wrap up this episode. Anyways, thank you for listening in. Hopefully, this was understandable. We were all over the place, but hopefully, we got to every point that was necessary. Anyways, make sure to tune in on Friday for the weekly news episode. Anyways, thank you, and thank you for listening in.